Ladies and gentlemen, the organizers, Archaic and its possibilities today, members of ARENA, Architecture Research in Europe Association, Philo Network, and the other networks, and the School of Architecture of Clermont-Ferrand, the GFO Lab, Group of Research, Philosophy, and the School of Architecture Paris-La Villette, and Chris Eunice, that I will commend, because she is the creator of the GFO, and she's at the heart of those meetings, annual meetings, architecture and philosophy. And here we're very attached to these meetings. In Paris, it's in 1987 that the first meeting commemorated the encounter of both disciplines. It was called Measure for Measure, Architecture and Philosophy, organized by CCI, International College of Philosophy, at the Beaubourg. And we could discuss how philosophy could grasp architecture as close as possible. It's upon this memory that our collaboration started when in 2014, GFO suggested to get back to this issue today. So what about the crossroads of our practices? First colloquium in 95 was again architecture, again philosophy. I hear Benoit Goethe say again. He was part of the sponsors, or godfathers of this first session. In 2016, we welcomed the second action at the turn of experience. It was about interrogating architecture and philosophy from a point of view of the Anthropocene. How could architecture as a mode of survey, of investigation, and as a manufacturer of experience can meet this double task of representing the world and molding a new world? And last year, sorry for this long preamble, the Synergic Design Colloquium was held, well, whatever, here. It re-interrogated this future of the practices facing the major myths of Anthropocene, trying to listen to the call for new interactions, call for new experimentations, new synergies that are composing with the emergency of transformation and the challenges, environment, ethics, aesthetics of the era. And I'm very glad to welcome the fourth session. It becomes a routine that will explore, as seen from the Anthropocene, what might signify the uptake of the building in its archaic dimension. We have 2 days to explore this venue. I'll conclude by saying again, we're very glad, very happy to this cross-meeting between philosophy and architecture, even more so here, of architects and philosophers. It says more, it's telling more. It's not where one discipline would be on top of the other, because they naturally tend to take this position. But it's between professionals, each one exposing and disclosing its works. So welcome, and I leave the floor to Xavier Bonzani. Welcome.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Marie-Hélène. I'm Stéphane Bonzani, not Xavier. Stéphane Bonzani, that's my name. Thank you for your introduction and presentation. At the end of the 80s, there was a book that was published called Le Philosophe et l'Architecte, Philosopher and Architect, written by Daniel Payot. And in his book, Daniel Payot gets back to the 3 meanings around the word arché, which is the root of the word architecture. That's the first meaning, beginning, origin. Then the sense of principle. And finally, there is the sense of command. Payot shows how those 3 figures intertwine in this complex prefix and help define the idea of architecture in the West. use the term architecture still to resound these harmonics of the beginning, of the principles and the command. But the times do not insist as strongly on these different strings. The figure of the command, the chief, the master who prevailed at the time when the architect could introduce himself as a hero is long gone. The figure of the principles, the idea of an architect designing or conceiving under the dictation of great immutable principles, seems as well to be outdated. If the architect is again back to the beginning, the initial, to this experience of initiality, if arche, this prefix of this word architecture, would refer directly to this Greek verb archain, which means to begin, to initiate. In any case, this seems to be apparent when we look at the architectural production of recent years. What do we see? Monolith blocks, which seem to thwart any compositional sophistication, like as Jacques Lucan spotted it. Cabins, simple shelters, economic, precarious, atmosphere which engage sensory experiences and invite us seemingly to deliver ourselves of our cultural background. Raw materials revisited, earth, soil in particular. Projects also where what counts is less the performance of the result than the reappropriation of the archaic gesture of building. We could define all this as initial practices, whether by forms, materials, constructive logic, gestures. It is about beginnings, or rather restarts, resumptions, resets. Born by great figures of contemporary architecture as Peter Zumthor, Iris Mateos, by professionals or collectives turned towards the empowerment of inhabitants, builders like Rural Studios or Francis Quéré. These practices all share, despite the tremendous differences between them, the trust in these archaic gestures to give a meaning and seek less the reference in the rich scholarly culture of architecture in the city than in the original and historic experience of human installation. Put oneself back on initial conditions, an almost impossible bet in a world strongly marked by anthropization. This resurgence of archaic gesture can be, of course, explained in some cases by a fragile economic contest, even devastated, which forces the architects, and by that word I call all those who make the act of building, even before the professional division of disciplinary, to reconnect with a form of primitive necessity and critically review their role in a conventional production system, which is not adapted to the fragile situation of the rural world. But this reading, based exclusively on the economic parameter, do with little, be frugal, and so on, is not satisfactory. It doesn't take account for a much larger movement. If the economic criterion was the only one to determine this resurgence, how can we explain this resurgence with Oma, Herzog, Meron, or Ishigami? Three architectural companies whose territories or actions do not have the fragility of those mentioned above. It's a much deeper movement that engages the whole relationship with the world. In a famous text, Walter Benjamin mentioned the emergence in the early 20th century of new barbarians, aiming to reinvent the parameters of art, architecture, and city. Adolphe Loos, Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier, Paul Klee, even Albert Einstein are described by Benjamin as figures of this positive barbarism. This barbarism is not associated, according to Benjamin, with a form of nihilism aimed at destruction. Although tired of the burden of culture, the creators of this modernity, while wishing to leave it, seek above all to start again, aspire to a new beginning, able of giving a future to these men, these newborns, as Benjamin said, new poor in experience. The gesture of starting over, resetting, making a fresh start, and perhaps a refounding is not new in the history of architecture. It's even one of the most recurring gestures whose modernity cannot arrogate property. Vitruvius to Logier, Alberti to Venturi, Ledoux to Van Eyck, Durand to Wright, to Kahn, or even to Grigotti, Rossi, Ando, or even Koolhaas. The temptation to start again is present, more or less explicit, in the practice of those architects or theorists. The new beginnings find their reason in an often dark observation of the contemporary situation and aim to reactivate a deep sense of architecture. It appears then less as a sophisticated art than as a practice of the installation of man on earth, whatever this earth. Perhaps the transition of our time is also caught in this reset. For Bruno Latour, who was present at the last colloque on architecture and philosophy, it is about a reset modernity. He describes through the eponymous exhibition held in Karlsruhe in 2016 the whole of procedures of deconstruction of the modern paradigm necessary to the reinitialization of our new relationship to the world, to this destruction of the modern ethos, to the destruction of the image of the globe that the moderns have formed, succeeds a new fragile but lucid state, a form of new origin that would not be a return to a first virginity or to an ideal state, but similar to the situation of pioneers in the world that we think we know, but finally turned out to be very strange. It is therefore possibles that are at stake each time. And this is one of the questions that this conference intends to raise. Does the archaic make it possible to invent, to make possible that faculty from which were deprived the exhausted characters of Beckett, according to Gilles Deleuze? With its title, Archaic and It's Possible Today, this symposium proposes to auscult, to investigate the contemporary. Archaic today. The words may seem paradoxical. Does the archaic belong to a bygone era? Are we very far from those origins, architecture, urbanism, landscape? Do they have anything to do with what appears at first sight primitive, raw, or prehistoric? Are not our territories palimpsests, loaded with a long and complex history, distancing them infinitely from the first times? The use of the term archaic is not neutral and requires a crucial conceptual distinctions on the outset. For historian thought, the archaic is indeed a period, an era, an age that precedes other epochs, classical, modern, postmodern, and so on. The arche, whose term stems, insists on the origin, the starting point, the beginning. According to this conception and in the progressive perspective, the archaic is what brings us back to the ancestors and obscurities that our civilization would have rid us of. The archaic is then summoned in the contemporary context only to point at inertias, forms, behaviors, or retrograde modes of thoughts, at best obsolete, at worst dangerous. According to the order of historic temporality and the values of progressivism, archaic is thus what we are moving inexorably away from, a distant origin on the basis of which we measure our evolution. In philosophy, but also in the field of the science of nature, genetics, or even psychoanalytics, archaic doesn't have the same meaning. It is a question of qualifying a state, a nascent or beginning phase. It is not rejected in the distant past. Conversely so, it operates again and again. Stem cells, the unconscious, have in common this quality of acting at the very heart of the new. It is even characteristic of the archaic to endure and resist the passage of time, the contingency of the moment, of the present. It is thus a non-historic category of a beginning, yes, but of a continued beginning. In a sense, it is its non-actuality that makes it paradoxically actual, current. This paradox has already been noted by Agamben. According to him, there is between the archaic and the modern, I'm quoting him, a secret meeting, not only because the most archaic forms seem to exist on the present a special fascination, but especially because the key of the modern is hidden in the immemorial and the prehistoric. If there's no surprise to find the archaic at the heart of the contemporary, it remains nevertheless to say in what forms. It's up to each era to update the archaic under various figures, not in the same way. If there's a resurgence of the archaic today, it doesn't identify with those experienced in other times. Archaic figures as the golden age mobilized by the Renaissance, or the primitive cabane that we'll talk later during this symposium, as erected as a model by Marc-Antoine Logier in the 18th century, of a Louis Kahn anxious to get out from an exhausted modernism, met in the times the necessities inherent to this phase of history, search for an ideal model, truth and moral criterion. One of the theoretical stakes of this conference will be to better identify archaic expression figures in the field of contemporary architecture, but also to look for more or less conscious patterns. Finally, through our discussions, we will also discuss the ambivalence that always goes along those resurgences. The 2 days of colloquium will be organized around conferences and round tables. Jacques Lucan, Marc Barani, Javier Rosmaijo of the H. Architectes, François Guéry, Chris Younes, from their point of view of practitioners, theoreticians, philosophers, will give us some insights to apprehend this question of archaic. 6 round tables for their part bring together communication that seemed to resonate with one another and revolve around one of the many facets of this issue of archaic. This afternoon we'll begin these debates with a session on facilities, installations. Several papers have indeed reflected on this initial gesture of the foundation to show its permanence, but also its limits in the liquid world. The second round table will deal with inventions, design processes, methods used by architects, and comes back to a way of doing, interrogating, thinking this issue of beginning. Tomorrow, the 2 morning sessions will focus respectively on archetypes and on the body and affects. Archetypes never cease to fascinate, you have seen this in the pictures, but are there models to be followed, icons, or matrix of invention? Are they locking us into a bias or enable us to allow varied exploration? We'll find out tomorrow. Sensation at the core of all projects that seek to create atmospheres. Do they offer us a way of thinking about the archaic otherwise, without a recourse to cultural forms? We'll explore those issues from a phenomenological inspiration where the archaic is feeling. Tomorrow afternoon, the 2 last sessions will focus on travel and fiction. The archaic moves, allows to make a detour, and is mainly around the relation to animality that will be played this excursion. To think the archaic puts us in a complex relationship with nature, refers us to the point of intersection between nature and culture, between animality and humanity. But the archaic is also a fictional narrative. The story of origin is constant among architects. In this session, the archaic is especially the occasion of an experience of thought, in which the past and the future, before and after, correspond and thwart the historic order. In parallel with conferences and roundtables, an exhibition, modest exhibition, of pictures of the archaic is held in the room next to this auditorium. It brings together the images that the contributors to this conference have kindly sent us and sheds a light on very different aspects of this issue. I'd like to thank the Cité de l'Architecture for once again welcoming these meetings between architecture and philosophy. I thank all the speakers who took part and the diversity of their points of view who contribute to enriching this issue. Thanks to the moderators Pauline Lefebvre, David van der Borg, Simon Tessou, Julie Catan, Xavier Bonneau, who will be in charge of emceeing those round tables. Thanks to the Scientific Council, which had the task of assessing the many proposals we have received, testimony of the interest among the architects and philosophers to this kind of encounters. Thanks to the organizing committee, Chris Younes, Xavier Bonneau, and the students Victor Fregnaud, Dimitri Schutter, Romain Manteau, who spared no efforts in making this event happen. And finally, thanks to all the partners who helped us to finance the conference, the Philo, the School of Architecture of Clermont-Ferrand, and the Caisse des Dépôts, and the interpreters who will interpret. And the interpretation I see I see the names of those people here on screen. Part of the symposium will be held here today, Colloque, and tomorrow you'll be split simultaneously here and in the Anatole de Baudot room. You will not get lost in the corridors of this building. I leave the floor to Jacques Lucan, architect, theorist, and historian of architecture, whose invitation was obvious in such a symposium. Indeed, Jacques Lucan has largely contributed to put in perspective this resurgence in the field of contemporary production. Let me remind you that Jacques Lucan is a honorary professor of the Polytechnic School of Lausanne and the School of Architecture of Marne-la-Vallée. He published several books, studies, articles, among which recently Precision on the present state of architecture in 2015, a book within which the archaic is identified as one of the concepts from which to be able to comprehend the architecture of today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for that invitation. I do hope that what I have to say to you will be in tune with the goals of the symposium. Let me begin straight away. My presentation will take part in 5 acts. The first act, we've often pointed out that Pablo Picasso, in 1906, went to the Iberian art exhibition at the Louvre after the excavations done in Basuna and Cerro de los Santos, a primitive or archaic sculpture exhibition, and here is one example. They also mentioned the importance for him of knowing what was referred to then frequently as nigger art. Some African sculptures seen at Henri Lorrain and Henri Matisse for the first time. Picasso's interest in primitive art was not ethnographic. He did not look at the ritual, mythical, or symbolic dimension of these objects. He didn't see any starting moment in the beginning of sculpture. His interest focused on the formal dimension. The objects to which Picasso paid attention showed elements that were gathered brutally, elements that became signs with an analogical relationship with reality. Since, like this Grévaux mask from Côte d'Ivoire that Picasso bought in 1912 from Daniel Henri Capweiler. Capweiler, an art merchant and collector of Picasso's paintings, said in 1948 that he was then moving away from imitations. I quote, Having discovered the real character of painting and sculpture, which are forms of writing, the product of these arts, Vela spoke of primitive arts, later on referred to as the first arts. The first of these arts are signs, emblems, and not a mirror that more or less distorts the external world. This evidence that was recognized then set the plastic arts free of any servitude with respect to illusionist arts. Grébeau masks bore witness to this dimension of signs in all purity. The human face that was seen, or rather read, did not coincide with the details of a sign. Picasso's interest in the primitive or archaic represents therefore a liberation, as Vela said, a drive towards a new beginning, a new development in his art. What's at stake for Picasso was not a matter of imitating forms or reusing them. What was essential for him was not an iconographic imitation. What was at stake was a syntactic effort, meaning a work that focuses on the formal relations maintained by the elements forming the pictorial or sculptural work itself. More generally speaking, an interest in primitive art represents the possibility of escaping from the difficulties of today. Let us speak about Picasso and Matisse in this way. Iman Leroy, the art historian, speaks of the law of the grandfather. I quote, "To set oneself free from the intimidating achievements of the immediate predecessors, artists and writers in seeking notoriety, skip one or several generations. Artists and writers, I'm speaking, artists and writers skip one or several generations," and he says further about Matisse that the recourse to primitivism and archaism is for him, amongst other things, a way of doubling Cézanne and getting out of his orbit. What Yves de Lavoie describes here, someone like the famous art historian Erwin Panofsky, had already stressed that, more broadly speaking, well before. He said that when you look into the profundity of some artistic problem to such an extent that you reach a deadlock if you continue to continue working with the same assumptions, in general that leads to major reactions, or better yet, a major steps backwards. That reversal, often linked to the sudden transformation of the role of a guide to another genre or a new artistic domain, makes it possible, by abandoning the achievements of today for the benefit of the return to forms of representation that are apparently more primitive, to use the construction of a new structure, or to build a new structure rather, materials taken from the demolition of the ancient. The second act. Before architecture exists, human beings had been seeking for precarious protection under trees, or more sustainably in caves under trees. That's the image here of Viollet-le-Duc in his history of human habitation. After which, human beings erected primitive huts. Viollet-le-Duc represents it as an arc formed by trees that are tied together at the summit. It looks like a circular ogival vault. You know that Viollet-le-Duc loved Gothic architecture. But here too I believe that you shouldn't look at the form just as a form. You must also look at his syntax, the syntax that created this form. For that I come back in time to the well-known image by Antoine Laugier showing the origins of architecture as the building of a first cabin that looks like what later becomes a Greek temple. The column, the frontispiece, according to the issues that Gertrude already saw. But it goes further than that. He goes further than that. The cabin becomes a model to refer to. He says, the small rustic cabin I just described is the model based on which all the magnificence of architecture was imagined. Other theoreticians in architecture at the same time, in the 18th century and the start of the 19th century, said the same thing. Therefore, in the first volume devoted to architecture in the methodical architecture Pankow in 1988, it is said that what's precious is a sort of enchanted mirror. The perverted and corrupted art could not bear the sight of it, and when you recall its origin, it can always bring it back to its initial virtue. Perverted and corrupted art is that of the middle of the 18th century. In other words, for Catherine de Cancy, the extravagances of the Baroque and the Rococo, a moment of decadence that lost its virtue. To re-find its virtue, you'll have to go back in time and reinterpret the cabin. Let us not forget that he, Catherine de Cancy, advocates a rigorous neoclassicism. What is the lesson we should draw once again from the cabin? That of the coherence of a language that has its own rules that you must be able to recognize and develop. And in that respect, regardless of the differences, Logis and Vieux-le-Duc's cabin, they both have something in common. Indeed, for Logis or Vieux-le-Duc, the structure is essential in building the architecture. This is what creates a constructive syntax and the architectural syntax. It gives prevalence to the skeleton, to the frame, to the detriment of the walls. If we were now to turn to Gottfried Semper's cabin, we would see that the structure is considered as secondary with respect to the enclosure. This is the real reason why a shelter was built to protect. This way of viewing architecture then takes us to the problems in connection with walls, with respect to the casing. Now, the view of archaic structures, I believe, does not seek to once again find original forms that will be more essential than others. Archetypes, primordial archetypes, no. The goal is to recognize what is at stake in the design, in the conception that one has of architecture, a formal conception of a syntactic nature. The third act, during the 20th century, the interest for primitive architecture and the interest for vernacular architecture was almost the same. I could take the well-known example of the book by Bernard Wodowski, Architecture Without Architects, published in 1964. At the same exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, let us note, before going further, that the publication in 1964 of Architecture Without Architects corresponds to a moment of crisis when the principles of modern architecture were called into question. 2 years later on, in 1966, the same Museum of Modern Art in New York produces Venturi's book, Complexity in Architecture, 1966. Yet again, the same year in Italy this time, we saw the publication of Architettura della Città by Vittorio Grocchi. Architecture Without Architects draws up a list of many different examples of architectures that can be referred to as primitive, popular, or vernacular. These examples, in most cases, relate to a pre-industrial period. The implicit goal of Bernard Wodowski is to show that all of these structures were built without architects and corresponded at best to a mode of living that was anchored in a geographic territory whose resources they exploited. What is implied is that the industrial society that led to the uprooting of populations, that society was unable to produce housings of that quality in terms of the roots. The interest is mainly anthropological. At the time, it was shared by different players. at Groenendyk in particular, who at the same point in time visited Dogon territory and the Arizona in the villages, showing relations between lifestyle and spatiality that already learned from the Sad Tropics by Levi-Strauss, describing the Bouvalou village. Let us come back to architecture without architects now. I'll choose 2 pages devoted to Portugal. In 1962, the National Union of Architects, which was then a part of the institutions reflecting upon architectures in the days of Salazar, published a major work on popular architecture in Portugal in 2 volumes. A sum of knowledge and many different buildings and farming and urban institutions of a vernacular nature. Amongst the contributors to this major work in 2 volumes, therefore, meaning architects who took part in taking note of these constructions, we have Fernando Tagoa. From this looks like primitive temples, and we understand that they're linked to a particular architectural environment, a specific farming, a territory, providing material, here granite, and ancestral lifestyles, anthropological data that are actually implicitly linked. And when you discover these extraordinary architectural objects, you can then understand that they fascinated Távora, Álvaro Siza with Eduardo Sousa de Moura. In actual fact, in the history of 20th century architecture, the interest for vernacular architecture is continuous and is clearly an expression of a sort of nostalgia at a time when everything seems to be in tune. In that sense, Le Corbusier is quite expressive. In one of his books, Almanac of Modern Architecture, published in 1926, a text states it all. A standard burns and a standard dies. An example of a standard that dies is that of the traditional house in Brittany. This house, according to Le Corbusier, it took centuries for it to get there, and for centuries it no longer changed. It is a type. The stone came out of the soil, and the roofing was gathered from the fields. He adds that the whole houses, the sites and cultures form one, like the head and the body. But he also adds, in analysis of the house itself, that the railways brought tiles and the roof was replaced. The fault is due to the railways, meaning the industrial deterritorialization, and the house in Brittany is no longer a traditional house in Brittany. As of that point, he notes, or he has a new lucidity. He further adds that the standard is a work of perfection. The railway connected countrysides to the large cities. Perfecting comes from the great city. The standard is now established in the large city. Le Corbusier, here about the house in Brittany, expresses the change of the times, a change with a tint of nostalgia, a nostalgia of a time when everything was in tune, of an organic time. As some may have said, this awareness is that of having to master means that are now the means of what Le Corbusier himself called the machinist civilization that seeks and will find its architectural expression. We must now build in mass, invent what will become further on the new vernacular that is attuned to the industrial society. For 10 years, from 1926 to 1936, Le Corbusier spent his summer holidays in the Arcachon Basin at Lupéquet, a house that looked more like barracks than villas as you would see today. At the Arcachon Basin, he drew different cabins and houses that are precarious constructions, and he describes the occupation of a wild territory. What he states in Maison un Palais, a house of palace, published in 1928, and I quote him at length, the railway stopped by the sands covering the forest. It is isolated from the earth because the railway stopped there. The terrain itself is precarious, belonging to only one large landowner. The fishermen are just tolerated there. They cannot erect stone houses founded on a land that does not belong to them. They bring about a pure project with no claims of history or culture or the taste of the day. They build a shelter day by day using poor materials that they found in the surroundings. A program that is not encumbered with any claims to history, culture, a shelter, day by day, using poor material. From 1937, Le Corbusier goes to the Mediterranean, and in 1952, we all know this, at Roquebrune, Cap Martin, he built his primitive cabin. His hut where he often stayed until he died. Since I'm speaking about this vacation houses, I would like to come back to architecture without architects one last time. And let me open up a double page. The bottom referring to an example of Les Trouilles, an ancestral housing in the Italian region of Les Pouilles. This housing was made of individual entities that were grouped together, housing animals and people, fully made of stone. They were scattered or grouped together to form villages. They all have the same form in general. They're all built in the same way. They all have almost standard dimensions, leading to a homogeneous landscape. We can say that this structure is a type. In 1954, Bernard Lelowski said about this type, which he called an archaic house, despite many invasions. The type he's referring to invasions, human invasions, that crossed the Pouilles region. Despite many invasions, the type survived almost without any changes since the second millennium before Jesus Christ. He still offers a good housing. A good housing, assuredly, but not for the same population. Today, the Trouilles are becoming more and more secondary houses, or offer an ideal housing for an archaic experience, the time of residing in a luxurious hotel. Not far from the Pouilles, there was a particularly extraordinary city for a second architectural experience, Matera, European capital of culture next year in 2019, as a matter of fact. This is a town with a troglodytic housing that is very old, where people and animals, once again, in terrible sanitary conditions live, to such an extent that in 1952, the Italian government decreed the evacuation and rehousing of all 15,000 inhabitants in these caves. Today, several of these caves have become restaurants and luxury hotels, proposing archaic temporary residence. And this is sponsored by David Copperfield. Now, we continue with the title of the symposium, The Truly, Les Pouilles, and the Caves by Matera. Are they not, by paradoxical reversal, amongst the potentials of architecture today, just like cabins, teepees, and igloos that the commerce and travel agents offer us? A third act, the two attitudes I referred to before moving on to Les Pouilles and Matera with respect to the primitive or archaic, may be put under two different perspectives that are not mutually exclusive and should not be opposed to each other. On the one hand, we have the formal viewpoint, which I refer to as being syntactic, and on the other hand, the anthropological perspective, and in each case I tried to understand the interests it could have for us. Put differently, what I referred to before is on the one hand a movement backwards to go forward, and on the other hand a movement to question the anthropological dimension of occupied territory, viewed in light of our present. The latter being the object of an implicit criticism. The step back, although different in their purpose, sort of forget or discard recent developments intentionally, a sort of deletion of culture, not being encumbered by claims to history and culture, as Le Corbusier said. The modern appeal for archaism, is it a part of the same movement of withdrawal? Here my assumption is that the protagonists of an approach to architecture that I would refer to as being phenomenological are part of a similar movement. Precisely, about the phenomenological approach, what does Maurice Merleau-Ponty says, the author of the Phenomenology of Perception? For Merleau-Ponty, we must look at the world as it is, a world before the reflection of what that world object will be later on. You must come back to things in themselves, the world before knowledge, of which knowledge always speaks. He adds, and he asks himself this question: how can we come back to this perception fashioned by culture, to a raw or wild, savage perception? Phenomenology is the intention to come back to the experience, a rigorous exploration of the experienced. The phenomenological approach puts emphasis on sensations that can be felt immediately, to the contrary of a cultural intellectual approach that calls into question the intelligibility of architecture in view of its history and recent developments. In my view, the most recent developments may be viewed as being worthy of a Manierist period. Manierism here, with all the knowledge and culture, the many different possibilities of variations in artistic and architectural forms, were experienced and exhausted in some cases. The manner, or maniera in the Italian sense of the term, is what is related to the individual expression of the artist, to what we refer to as his style, which may be extremely sophisticated. The artist tends to look at himself doing, putting the emphasis on how he does things instead of why he does things. About Manierism, the 16th century, Italian Manierism, Henri Chastel noted that Leonardo da Vinci himself thought that painting declined each time it sought to see its model in art instead of in nature, in other words, in reality. So to move away from realism to manierism, you must avoid using art as a model, using culture as a model. You must, in a way, become naive, primitive, or archaic. This is the attitude adopted by Joseph Beuys. So important for Peter Zumthor, Jonathan Sergeson, and Stefan Beggs, for Avan Caruso and Peter St-Jobs, for example. All of these architects see in him the artist who exalted matter, raw matter, inhabitual, unusual materials that were even repelling sometimes. They knew Beuys in 1978, when he was not yet a known architect. Eusé Legomenon said that he opened up a mysterious world full of unappealing, ill-smelling materials, with formal and material relations that were complex. His work had something that was archaic, reminded us of authors that were confined to the 19th century. In this light, we can understand that some contemporary artists, particularly interested in a phenomenological approach, including the ones I referred to earlier, were particularly interested in issues linked to perception, and as a result, by minimalist artists, such as Donald Job, Robert Morris, or Richard Serra, for example, who knew of Merleau-Ponty's ideas. A translation of the Phenomenology of Perception was published in 1962 in the United States. In the perspective we're looking at here today, what does Peter Zumthor, what's he looking for? I quote, he wants to reveal the essence, the very essence of the material, which is free of any meaning inherited from any culture. The very essence, free of any meaning inherited from any culture. Surgeon and Bates, they want to return to an ancient elementary knowledge that still exists beyond the cultural meaning. As Bergonon, speaking about the Olympic Stadium in Beijing, tell us, in a way, architecture is an archaic medium, physically involving us without setting any distance at all. The distance is that of history and culture.
From then on, we might look at a great amount of contemporaneous projects looking to exalt sensations which are primitive. Projects that suggest often as a face-to-face with matter, with matters implemented. Natural matter or artificial matter, but always with the aim to discover the qualities unknown yet, unperceived yet, matters for which play also the erosion of time and of the weather. All this work on matter gave way to exceptional production. All this work renewed or enriched our capacity to look. Projects are also adopting irregular figures, uncanny, as if the architect didn't know, if he forgot his knowledge in terms of geometry, forget the knowledge, making that his polygons, irregular, are absolutely non-descriptible. The results are sometimes singular forms or shapes that cannot be compared one to the other, that only can be within a type, form can become unique, an icon. It's contemporaneous, undoubtedly. The icon looks for absolute originality. Ideally, it looks like nothing else. It refers to nothing. Often, it looks for spectacular, but also the production of those architectural events, spectacular, is embedded in the paradox. At the same time as an architect shows his empathy for the primitive of the archaic, he will use means which are very costly and sophisticated. From this point of view, the case, the most extraordinary one, is the one of Ishigami. The current exhibition at the Cartier Foundation is very successful, with an enlightened audience and with architects mainly. The presentation of the exhibition made by the Cartier Foundation highlights, and I quote, "True ode to freedom. The exhibition Freeing Architecture proves the capacity of Yunya Ishigami to think his practice out of the limits of know-how and of the architectural thinking, out of the limits of know-how and thinking, i.e. out of the culture, towards a new archaism, the one here of a cave for the restaurant that you see the pictures of." Another architect would say that the operations he's proceeding in the elaboration of his project are especially elementary or basic. It's also the case for Ishigami. It's the case for people piling up projects like Herzog and de Meuron for Actenion in Basel. This piling up, disorderly, needed description tools and tools of computation very complex, and building techniques even more complex. Needless to say that what's not primitive are the means invested to implement this piling. To conclude, fifth act. Around 2010, Rem Koolhaas, spectacular icons designer. Think about Casa de Música de Porto and the CCTV of Beijing, starts to say, we have to put an end to the production of icons, revealing oneself as a fireman who is setting fire around him. He was saying that in 2015, I'm really disgusted by the current production of icons, overproduction of icons, detrimental to any other potentiality. I think the idolatry for architecture is an accumulation of bad faith. We have to find a way, if not a retirement, to find a plausible architecture. Okay. In 2014, at the Biennale of Venice, he's the curator. He requests to go back to fundamentals, suggesting an exhibition about the elements of architecture, the floor, the walls, ceilings, facade, balcony, corridors, fireplace, and so on and so forth. All those elements have an history. It is about to understand the modern developments. Colloque proposes nothing else but a return to culture. Before the central pavilion, Colloque commemorates a 100 years anniversary. He makes a model of what is the paradigm of modern architecture, the domino that Le Corbusier designed 100 years previously. This became the primitive cabin of modern architecture, a type beginning to the archaic of modern architecture that opened possibles, still open to possible. The origin is now historic. The origin is not to be reproduced, to be imitated in any way. If it is alluded to, it's to be interrogated to find new ways of designing architecture. No figures, no original figures, no archetypal figures, no historic formats, no essential forms, no primordial traces to think this phenomenon. Thank you.